To say that we are in the secular is to recognize that we are locating ourselves in an era of history in which the incursion of God into history has made a difference for everything, including politics.
Good evening, I'm Pete Peterson, Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and it's a great honor and pleasure to welcome you here to tonight's event, a discussion around James K. Smith's book, Awaiting the King. This is actually the second time that the School of Public Policy has hosted an event around this book. We were very excited to partner with our friends at the Trinity Forum in Washington, D.C. to host the book launch for this very important book a couple of years ago. Winston Churchill once said that we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. And what Churchill meant by that was that we are actually shaped by our built environment as well as our natural environment. What's so important about the message of Jamie Smith's book is that he is giving us a new pair of glasses to look at our political and policy lives. The School of Public Policy is one of only about 5 of 200 graduate policy schools based at a Christian university. And we take these questions around faith and politics, Christianity, and public policy very seriously. And that's why we're so delighted tonight to partner with our friends at the Center for Faith and Learning. And so without further ado, to get things kicked off, I welcome up my friend John Boyd.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So it is a pleasure, and Pete and I have been able to partner on a number of events. And so for the Center for Faith and Learning, the School of Public Policy, to partner on this event is a pleasure. We also have a couple of other partners, and actually a framing partner for this event that I want to tell you about. First of all, just the Pepperdine Libraries. And so they're obviously hosting us and providing this space and setup for us. And so we appreciate Mark Russa and the whole library team for this unique space. But also, kind of the primary host for this event is actually the University Spiritual Life Committee. And so the School of Public Policy and the Center for Faith and Learning are partnering with the University Spiritual Life Committee. It's hosted by my wife, Sarah, as the university chaplain. And the University Spiritual Life Committee is made up of faculty and staff from all 5 schools across Pepperdine, and it works to develop and mobilize a comprehensive vision for Christian spiritual formation at Pepperdine University. And there are a number of members of the University Spiritual Life Committee that are here right now, and they are also our host for this event. And as Pete said, we are going to spend the next hour and a half or so discussing issues related to political theology. And I look forward to this event for a lot of reasons, but maybe the primary reason is because of our presenters. And so I just briefly want to introduce our speakers and our panelists and the format, and then I'll get the program started here. As you know, our featured speaker tonight is Dr. James K.A. Smith, otherwise known as Jamie. Jamie is a professor of philosophy at Calvin College in Michigan, anytime you invite anyone from Michigan in February to come to Malibu, you have a pretty good shot of getting them. If you want to get out to Michigan, if you can at this time of year. But he is a sought-after speaker, he's a professor of philosophy, and he's a leading Christian public intellectual. He's an author of many books, a number of award-winning books, a number of essays and op-eds in venues such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, USA Today, and others. He also serves as editor-in-chief of Image Journal, which is devoted to faith and the arts. Jamie has a unique gift for communicating and translating big ideas and challenging our assumptions and expanding our imaginations. And he does that while doing a remarkable job of bridging the world of the academy, the world of the church, and wider society. And so we are really privileged, Jamie, to have you here. I have benefited for years from Jamie's work and feel very grateful to him for that. I know that that's true for many of you as well. And as Pete said, this session, he will especially focus on material from his 2017 book, Awaiting the King, Reforming Public Theology, which is the third part in a series of the Cultural Liturgy series, if you're familiar with that. And for this topic and for this conversation, the timing, in my opinion, couldn't be better. In our current political moment, in our age of political echo chambers and often less than civil discourse, we need scholars who can invite us into deeper reflections on faith and virtue and public life, scholars that invite us to investigate not just our big ideas, but often the unarticulated forces that shape our ideas and assumptions, which connects to, for some of you that were here earlier, connects to some of the cultural liturgies themes that Jamie talks about. And so for this topic and for the evening, Jamie is really a very uniquely gifted and qualified person. As is our respondent tonight. Responding and dialoguing with Jamie is our Pepperdine colleague, Jason Blakely. Jason is a professor of political science with expertise in political philosophy and hermeneutics. His work has appeared in top academic journals as well as popular venues like The Atlantic, The Washington Post, America Magazine. He's the author of several cutting-edge books, including Interpretive Social Science, co-authored with Mark Levere, a book entitled Alistair MacIntyre, Charles Taylor, and the Demise of Naturalism. And he also has a book forthcoming this summer from Oxford University Press entitled We Built Reality, How Social Science Infiltrated Culture, Politics, and Power. And so we have some very qualified people to lead us in our discussions with our keynote lecturer and our respondent. And I'll end by just saying this. I'm enthusiastic about this session, not just because of the importance of the topic, but because Jamie and Jason are people, obviously, of impeccable academic credentials, but they're also both people of deep personal faith, commitment to the church. Jamie is a Protestant in the Reformed tradition, Jason as Roman Catholic, but all of this sets us up for a rich and important discussion. And so the format will go as follows. Jamie will come and give us our keynote lecture for about 35 minutes or so. Afterwards, Jason is going to respond with a 10 to 12 minute response. And then Pete Peterson will come back up and host a panel discussion with the two of them for a few minutes, at which time we'll turn it over to some Q&A with the audience. So be thinking about questions and things that you would like to ask as well. So without further ado, please give a warmer than Michigan welcome to
It's a treat to sort of join a conversation, I'm sure, that's already happening on campus here at Pepperdine. And what I would like to do is I want to frame a Christian philosophy of public life, if you will, in terms, I'm going to frame it as a tale of two cities. But the two cities I want to talk about this evening are not those chronicled by Dickens, but rather those mapped by St. Augustine in the 5th century. The earthly city and the heavenly city, or as he called it, the city of man and the city of God. And I want to suggest that St. Augustine offers us a kind of toolkit for thinking through our political and public vocations, a framework that is at once perennial and, I think, timely. Before I unpack that, I'd like to give you a feel for Augustine's own counsel to Christians involved in government and public life. You might think of this as a kind of ancient North African version of counsel to Christians in policy. I'm thinking in particular of Augustine's ongoing, by the way, I should pause, not everybody loves Augustine the way I love Augustine, which I can't understand. But for those of you who have either forgotten or, I'm just going to assume you forgot. So St. Augustine or Augustine, St. Augustine lived late 300s, early 400s in North Africa, what would today be Algeria. Was a late convert to Christian faith, was compelled into the priesthood and eventually became a bishop and went on to become one of the great doctors of the Western Church. And what is also intriguing is that his work, The City of God, is still read in political science and political theory departments all across the country. And so what I'm doing is going back to Augustine, who I think, in some ways, if we can step out of the morass and malaise that is our current moments and find an ancient Christian who might help us find our stars again, and then we can come back to our present. That's sort of why I want to go back to Augustine, not as an antiquarian interest, but because I actually think he's so contemporary, perennial. And I want to give you one feel for this from Augustine's ongoing correspondence with a fellow named Boniface, who was a Roman general and African governor, and served in political office during a time of tumult and upheaval, which should sound a little bit familiar. And throughout this intimate correspondence, we have, by the way, shelves of Augustine's letters where you hear a very human counselor. And in this ongoing intimate correspondence, Augustine shows concern for Boniface's soul in his vocation in public life as a governor. And so he will write to him, and he begins, as he always does, with love. This then I can say briefly, he says to Boniface, love the Lord your God with your whole heart and your whole soul and your whole strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. He says that's still the most important counsel I can give you as an African governor. It's that same love that's at work in Boniface, Augustine points out. He says, by this love, all good believers daily make progress, desiring not to come to a kingdom of moral beings, but of mortal beings, but to the kingdom of heaven. And he reminds that this powerful political official of his ultimate allegiance to a kingdom beyond the empire that he serves. But Augustine also isn't afraid to admonish Boniface at times. And in fact, when later in his life, Boniface wants to chuck it all and retreat to the desert and writes Augustine a letter and says, can I just be a monk, please? Can I enjoy the holy leisure that the monks do? Augustine writes him back and won't let him off the hook. He says to him, you have a calling. Man your station, he exhorts him. God and his church need you to play the political role that you've been called to. Not even the difficulty and corruption of the political environment is sufficient excuse for Boniface to evade that call. Augustine puts it this way. If the Roman Empire has given you good things, albeit earthly and transitory ones, because it is earthly, not heavenly, and cannot give save what it has in its control, if then it has conferred good things upon you, do not repay evil with evil. You owe something even to this earthly city, Augustine reminds him, even if your ultimate hope is in a city that is to come. But perhaps Augustine's most prescient word to Boniface is one that could organize our reflections this evening. When Boniface is frustrated and tempted to impose his will, as if it were up to him to make the kingdom come, Augustine cautions him and says this, we ought not want to live ahead of time with only the saints and the righteous. We ought not want to live ahead of time with only the saints and the righteous. If tonight I can offer something of a map for Christian political involvement, you might think of it as a kind of 3D map. I don't know what that would be, a relief map or something. And it's what I want to do is I want to think about Christian political wisdom in a way that we locate where we are in relation to these two cities, but also establish when we are in relation to the coming kingdom. So where we are and when we are. And I think Christian political and public wisdom is really, ultimately, a biblical orientation to place and time. And Christian involvement goes wrong when we try, as Augustine puts it, to live ahead of time. Not living ahead of time is a pretty good model for what I'll call an unapologetic Christian realism about our public life and our political call. So where are we and when are we? Let's consider the Christian's political vocation then in terms of time and place. And by the way, I'm skipping a lot. I'm cramming a lot here. Ideally, if we had a longer conversation, we could talk about what's distinct about the citizen's calling, the civil servant's calling, the elected officials call. Do you know what I mean? Those are all, I'm just gonna, under one umbrella of the Christian's political calling, I'm gonna try to talk about things that are relevant to all of those, but there would obviously be ways that we'd wanna get more fine-grained, maybe in conversation. But what I wanna suggest is, for all Christians to think about their political vocation in terms of time and place. A wise, prudent, faithful public theology is one that is animated by enduring, perennial commitments, but is also attuned to the unique challenges and opportunities of time and place. So I'm talking about a frame and a posture that Christians should learn to cultivate, not so much strategies and formulae and positions, if you will. If you were looking for like a voting guide tonight, you're gonna be very disappointed. Now, this is exactly where, if we think about what does it look like for Christians to be publicly and politically faithful at this intersection of time and place, this is exactly why I think the ancient thinker Augustine offers us concepts that can be a bit of a toolkit that we can put to work today. And so I want to spend time on just two of these tools, if you will, two concepts that I think we can do some work with. The first is a time concept. It's a Latin word, unfortunately. It's the notion of what Augustine calls the seculum. The seculum. Now, when we hear seculum, what English word do you hear? Secular, right? Now, what's interesting is, I think we tend to think of secular in very spatialized terms, right? So you think of the secular square or secular institutions, or I guess maybe you might think of secular music. I want us to sort of try to put aside that common resonance or connotation, and instead to hear when Augustine talks about what he calls the seculum, it is an era, a time, an epoch, a season. It more specifically, for Augustine, the seculum is a long time because it's the time between cross and kingdom come. Now, you might say, well, what time's not included? Well, it's important because there's actually a lot of times that are not included in that. And one of the things it says is, we, today in the 21st century in North America, we live in this seculum, which is a time that is after the Christ event, but when we are still waiting for the kingdom to come. This is going to become very, very important. Because first of all, to say that we are in the seculum is to recognize that we are locating ourselves in an era of history in which the incursion of God into history has made a difference for everything, including politics. That is, we live in the shadow of the Christ event, which is, by the way, the incarnation of God in Christ, death, burial, resurrection, and ascension to a throne. Very, very, very important theme. So to locate ourselves in the seculum is to remember that we live after the cross, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, but before the arrival of the kingdom, the full arrival of the kingdom. It means, now what difference would that make if we live in the seculum? Well, I'll give you one concrete example. You expect pluralism. You expect pluralism. Why? Because every day you still pray, thy kingdom come. And every day you are praying, thy kingdom come, you know it's not here yet. So while we live in the wake and shadow of the significance of the Christ the King event, we also live with the reminder that we are awaiting the King. And that's going to be an important tension to live through. So in the seculum, Augustine would say, we expect pluralism. We're not surprised by disagreement or difference. We are not shocked or scandalized by such difference. Instead, what we are trying to do is wonder, how can we forge a life in common in the meantime and in the midst of it? That is the art and science of politics. The art and science of public life is not how can we create holy huddles and clusters where we all agree with one another as if we live ahead of time. It's how do you build a life in common now in the places in which we find ourselves. So we're in the seculum, and I want to suggest that it's going to change Oftentimes if Christians go wrong in public life, it's because they forget what time it is. Second, Augustine says the seculum, this era in which we find ourselves, is an era characterized by what he calls the permixtum. Sorry, I wasn't thinking there'd be so much Latin. But the permixtum is the messiness and mixed upness of, now, here's the other key concept, the two cities. The two cities. Augustine distinguishes between what he calls the earthly city and the heavenly city, or the city of man, forgive me, and the city of God. Everybody with me? Now, here, however, how many have heard that distinction before? Okay, I think many of us, oh, of course, policy people. But the distinction, we might be familiar with the distinction and then misunderstand it. I think there's a common reappropriation of Augustine, which makes it sound like, oh, the earthly city is this earth, and the heavenly city is some spiritual realm. As if this distinction is a distinction between two levels of reality or two different jurisdictions. The earthly city is the space of creation, and the heavenly city is the space of heaven. No, 1,000 times no. For Augustine, the distinction between the earthly city and the heavenly city is not a distinction between earth and heaven. And the distinction between the earthly city and the heavenly city does not come about when creation comes to be. The distinction and divergence between the earthly city and the heavenly city, the city of man and the city of God, is not creation, it's the fall. Why? Because what distinguishes these two cities is not a sphere, is not a jurisdiction, is not levels or spaces. What distinguishes the earthly city from the heavenly city is their loves. Their loves. In Book 19 of Augustine's City of God, he defines what a city is, a civitas, a republic. And he says a city, a civitas, is a multitude of rational agents united by a common agreement on the objects of their love. What is a city? A city is a collective, a community of rational agents, so thinkers, humans, united by common agreement on the objects of their love. So what distinguishes earthly city and heavenly city is not earth and heaven, it's what we love, what a people loves. And for Augustine, actually, our loves are bound up with worship. The distinction between these two cities is not jurisdictions. The origin of the distinction is the fall, and here's why it's important. If you fall into that trap of thinking that the distinction between the earthly city and the heavenly city is the distinction between earth and heaven, then what will happen is you think that politics is essentially earthly, right? This is actually a common way that it's misdeployed, the distinction. So then what will happen is if you think that, oh, this is a distinction between earth and heaven, this is spiritual and this is earthly, politics obviously is what characterizes our temporal creaturely existence. And so politics must just be like a necessary evil of earthly life. And we couldn't ever imagine a distinctly Christian politics because politics is just owned by earth. And in fact, what will happen is in the name of the heavenly city, you'll get very apolitical, almost anti-political standing. What Augustine, if you properly understand Augustine's distinction between the earthly city and the heavenly city, there is earthly city politics, but there is also heavenly city politics. What we're talking about are two radically different configurations of what social life is called to be, right? The earthly city doesn't own politics. There is an earthly city kind of politics, but that is not the last word on what politics has to be. The heavenly city is actually the vision of a kingdom indexed vision for what social, political, public, communal life would look like. And the question is, what does it look like for there to be inbreakings of that in the meantime? Does that make sense? I feel like, okay, we're gonna get started. So you've got the time concept, we're in the seculum, and now you've got this place concept, the distinction between the heavenly city and the earthly city, except it turns out those aren't two different places. In fact, what Augustine would say is, in the seculum, citizens of the heavenly city and citizens of the earthly city are all thrown together in this permixtum and are trying to forge a life in common together, which is necessary in the meantime of our waiting. So if to just pick one example, in some sense, this is completely arbitrary in a way, but the borders of the United States are one of many, but just one particular carving out of a people, and within that contested territory and terrain are citizens of the earthly city and the citizens of the heavenly city, and yet, in the meantime of the seculum, we are all trying to figure out how we might live together in peace in the meantime. That's the art and science of politics and public life. So what difference does this make? What difference do these ideas and concepts, these tools make? First of all, let's talk about time concepts. I don't know if, I'm sorry if I'm bringing too much theology to this, but here's the thing. I actually think the most important thing that Christians in political and public life need is an eschatology. Now, what do we mean by an eschatology? An eschatology is, whenever you hear eschaton, last things, coming kingdom, what we are expecting. Why does eschatology make a difference? To say that Christians are an eschatological people is just to say we know the kingdom's not here yet. The kingdom's not here yet, and we don't make it come. We don't build it. We don't create it. It's not up to us. We are awaiting the king. Now, why would that be significant in terms of our public life? Because it runs deeply counter to utopianisms of both left and right. You see why? In other words, what characterizes utopianisms, whether of left or right, you know what I mean, right? There could be two different versions of this. Utopianisms of both left and right are trying to live ahead of time. They're trying to say, oh, it's up to us, and we can make this happen. So, on the one hand, a deeply progressivist default is actually an overconfidence in the capacity of human beings to build the just society. Which is precisely why what often goes along with a progressivism is a remarkable lack of insight into our own still crooked hearts. Do you know what I mean? Like there's actually a deep kind of confidence in our own purity, and we will instantiate what we know. If everybody else would just agree with us, we would finally get to the kingdom. However, on for lack of a better term, on rightward versions of this, you get kind of dominionist, reconstructionist versions, which is say, well, actually, God told us exactly what society is going to look like, and we know this so well. We are going to stamp out this society, and we're going to create it with our own ingenuity and holiness. You should be nervous about both of those schools of thought. And they are not conducive, actually, to prudential politics. Maybe another way of saying why eschatology is so significant for public life is to say, if you have an eschatological orientation, if you know you're in the seculum, your expectations are tempered. Right? You kind of have to relativize your expectations of what's accomplishable. And you make a lot of discerning judgments about that. This should engender exactly what Reinhold Niebuhr described as Christian realism. I think we need a real renaissance of people reading Reinhold Niebuhr. I know in the 90s there was a lot of conversation sort of around Stanley Hauerwas and folks that made us think that he was the problem. I've come to think that Reinhold Niebuhr was a gift that we would do well to read again. In a sense, what Niebuhr upholds that I think is at the heart of a faithful Christian public life is what I'll call the lost art of faithful compromise. That's, unless we can imagine what faithful compromise looks like, I actually don't think we'll ever be very effective publicly and politically. So, time makes a difference for eschatology. We know where we are. We know when we are in this secular. It tempers our expectations and we aren't overconfident in our own abilities. Secondly, though, the reason why this temporal dynamic is significant is because I actually think at the heart of a Christian public theology is discernment of the contingent historical effects of providence in our shared political institutions. Let me say that one more time. I think a big component of a Christian public theology is discernment of the contingent historical effects of providence in the political institutions that we inhabit. This is where I follow the lead of the British ethicist and theologian Oliver O'Donovan, who says that really, if you take seriously the gospel's impact in time and history, what you then have to do is discerningly read the history of the political institutions, I'll just say for our purposes, that we've inherited in the quote-unquote West. And to realize how many ways features of the political institutions that we think about in terms of constitutional democracy, representation, and so on and so forth, are actually the direct legacies of the gospel's impact on political life. That there are features of constitutional liberal democracy that were unthinkable as political configurations until Christianity made its dent on the West. So O'Donovan has this metaphor, he says, like a planet that is pocked with crater marks by the bombardment it receives from space. The political institutions of the West bear the passing marks of Christ's dawning glory, embedding itself. So that there's ways where so I'm going to get on a little soapbox right now. This is exactly why Christians can't demonize the institutions, practices of constitutional liberal democracy, which is a bit of a trend right now. I don't know how you all are plugged in, but I get that we can see that there's a sort of brokenness that characterizes our political environment right now. Wanting to burn down liberal democracy does not seem like the best way to guard the vulnerable. And if you realize that so many of these features of representation, mercy and judgment, these really key characteristics that in a constitution, every ruler knows that they're ruled by someone else, right? Every ruler rules in such a way that there's someone looking over their shoulder. Those are features of our political institutions that are the bequeathment, I think that's a word, that are bequeathed to us by the gospel's impact on our political life. And I think Christians should be ones who are reminding our society of that legacy, not gleefully joining in the arson party. Third dynamic of this temporal thing is what I'll just say, and this is related to what I just said. I do think Christian public theology has to function as a kind of amnesia therapy. That is, political theology has a public role to play simply by re-narrating to late modern liberal societies their religious and theological inheritance. The fact is, the Enlightenment story that wants to be told about the emergence of democracy is not true. And it is proving itself insufficient to actually generate a populace that is committed to the virtues and practices that are required for liberal democracy. What I would say is, in some ways, the progressivist amplification of some elements of liberalism can't have what they want, because they are demolishing and eroding precisely the institutions that give birth to the kinds of citizens who can inhabit and function in constitutional liberal democracies. So there's a sense in which our society can't have what it wants, and we should remind them of that. We should also, though, be talking about how and why churches used to be one of the incubators of citizens. Okay. It's interesting. Last December, I visited the House of Lords in London. and was given a tour of the Houses of Parliament by a Christian architectural historian. And he pointed out to me, we went into what's called the sovereign's robing room, which is where the Queen, before she would ever enter the House of Lords, would step into this sort of antechamber. And what's interesting is when she would, there's a sort of a tiny throne in there. I can't believe they didn't let us sit on it. There's a throne in the robing room. And when when the Queen would be seated on this throne, she would look up and see a massive painting of the ascended Christ, the King above all kings. And on one hand, there were two twin figures beside him of justice and mercy. There was no mercy in politics before that crater mark of the gospel. And that the sovereign is reminded of the sovereign above, that's a feature of constitutional democracy that we can celebrate. Let me say, so let's think about the implications of this in terms of place. How would thinking about Christian public and political calling in terms of place make a difference? Well, first of all, I think we need to see that the church, the ecclesia, as Paul called it in the New Testament, is our center of gravity for our political life. Now, let me explain. I don't mean our partisan life. I mean the church is a body politic that pledges allegiance to a risen, ascended king. And in our formation in that body politic, our political imaginations are being nourished with a vision for what a healthy, flourishing, shalomed society would look like. So to the extent that we cultivate our imagination in the body politic that is the church, Christian worship is its own kind of civics. Christian worship is its own kind of development of our political imagination. And what Augustine would counsel is, we find our political identity and center of gravity in the ecclesia, and from there lean out into the messiness of our shared terrain with our neighbors to forge a common life fueled by that imagination. It's not just a question of where we are, but where we center ourselves. We need to bring the thickness and specificity of a gospel-shaped imagination to our public life and then offer it as a common good. A big part of what interests me in my book, Awaiting the King, which was mentioned, is actually an account of the assimilation of Christians to the defaults of partisan politics and polarized culture. I think we all feel this and experience it. And I think there are two aspects to explaining this assimilation. The first is we missed the liturgical nature of public and political life. We just missed it. That the rhythms and rituals of public life aren't just something that we do, they are also doing something to us. That public life into which we confidently bestride, equipped with our Christian worldview and marching orders for transforming culture, that is not a neutral space. It's not just waiting for you to come with the answers. It's a space that is rife with its own rituals and liturgies, and those rituals and liturgies bypass our convictions and conscript our affections. We fall prey to political idolatries, not because we've been convinced by bad ideas, but because we've been converted by disordered liturgies. And so one thing, as Pete put at the beginning, I often like to say, we need to put on sort of liturgical lenses of analysis of our public and political life and ask not just what is the message here, or what do they think, or what's their position, but what are the rhythms, rituals, and routines that I'm being conscripted into? And what is that teaching me to love? So I think we missed the liturgical nature of public politics and public life, but I also think there's an important way in which we missed the political nature of the church. Now there are 14,000 footnotes to that claim. But what I mean is, we missed that Christianity is not some privatized, atomized, me and Jesus moment. What is God doing? He is constituting a people who pledge allegiance to an ascended coming king. That's politics. Christian worship is the civics of the city of God, and the practices and disciplines of historic Christian worship carry this gospel social imaginary, and they rehearse a biblical vision for shalom and flourishing and justice. And insofar as we are immersed in those rhythms and rituals and rites, we are absorbing that biblical vision of what God wants for his creation, even here and now. And then we are sent into our political callings fueled with that picture, not just off-the-shelf ideological renditions of what the good should look like. While it might be counterintuitive, part of my argument is that the renewal of Christian political witness actually depends on the renewal of the church. That is, the formation of citizens, politicians, and civil servants who can contribute to the renewal and redemption of our public life depends on the renewal of the church and reforming our worship so that congregations can be biblically saturated, Christ-haunted imagination stations from which we are sent to love our neighbors and steward creation and build institutions that guard the vulnerable. I apologize, I'm taking too much time. Let me try to pull this together. I think our most significant investment for our political callings to be sent into the world is actually to invest in our formation in the ecclesial body politic, that is the church, because there we will learn to love what Christ the King loves. But what Christ the King loves is also what the prophets speak about and name and describe as a world in which none are hungry, a world in which there is abundance for all, a world in which people from every tribe and tongue and nation sing the same song. It's all directly relevant to our calling. We are formed to be sent. Outworking of mission, however, is always local. And I think what we need to remember is, in a way, the Christian political calling, I want to suggest, is crystallized in the neighbor. The neighbor. If you want to know, even though the whole point is to say, to be a citizen of Christ's kingdom is to be looking for a kingdom that is to come. Every time the prophets give you a hint of what that kingdom looks like, the prophets talk to you about widows, orphans, and strangers. They talk to us about neighbors. Politics is the art of the possible, but it is an art undertaken for the sake of the common good, a shared good, not our own interests. It's precisely because of this that we are called to love our neighbors, and that translates, I want to suggest, into a Christian obligation to invest in political institutions. If you want to care for the vulnerable, invest in repairing, restoring, renewing, and building institutions, which become shelters for those who are vulnerable. I think there are two forms of hopelessness that have infected the church today. It will seem odd to call both of these hopeless, but I want to try to explain how and why they are. One is a form of despair that talks a lot about God, but is governed by fear, and hence cynically believes that there's no hope, only power. And so we settle for earthly city political machinations of power, deception, and domination. Those strategies, I'm saying, are hopeless. The second is a form of misplaced confidence in human ingenuity and goodness, and believes that if only everyone would agree with us, we could bring about the kingdom of God. This engenders its own sort of fear of those who are different, who don't agree, and produces an intolerance that becomes increasingly impatient with those who resist. Hope is the opposite of fear and despair. Novelist Marilyn Robinson once said, "Fear is not a Christian habit of mind." Fear is not a Christian habit of mind. And perhaps the most important political word we hear from our ascended King is, be not afraid. Thanks very much.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Tough act to follow, obviously. Yeah, one of the things I really like about Jamie's work is that I see in it a heart that is on the line. I see a fellow Christian, a fellow Augustinian. I'm an Augustinian of sort of a different stripe than Jamie, but someone whose eye, his personal eye, is in place, and he's working through his desire in very Augustinian fashion, a journey toward a mystery. And so there's an unfolding of understanding that I see in Jamie's work, his talk earlier before dinner, where he's struggling with his own desire often, which is a very Augustinian thing, to try to arrive at lucidity, at a well-ordered desire as we sort of travel toward the mystery. In other words, we don't have a finality or a formula about politics. Well, there's so much I agree with, and there's so much in his book that is brilliantly articulated. It's not as simple as just opposing what Jamie has to say. Every time you think you're about to oppose him or affirm him, he sort of forces you a little bit to think for yourself. So I mean that as high praise. What instead I'm going to do is kind of pull it into my own way of thinking, which is a vice of academics. I'm a political theorist by training in hermeneutic philosophy. And so I'm going to put some of just one claim, because there's so much in Jamie's book. There's something to upset everyone, truly, in Jamie's book. And something for everyone to learn, though. And I'm going to put one claim to come about liturgy into my own terms, into hermeneutic terms, very briefly, and then I'm going to raise a couple questions. I'm not even sure to what extent we disagree on this. Maybe it's just a disagreement of emphasis. So a central thesis of the philosophical tradition of hermeneutics, and one that I think plays an important part in this argument about liturgy, is that we are cultural self-interpreting animals. So the great American anthropologist Clifford Geertz says that human agency is incomplete except through the medium of culture. In other words, if you took a human being, this weird like fantasy that 18th century Europeans had, and you just eliminated culture, you wouldn't have a human being. As Clifford Geertz said, you'd have a monster. In a sense, we're cultural animals, in other words. Add to that a second hermeneutic thesis. We're cultural, but we're not just cultural in any way. We form our culture around an identity that has some highest good. What the philosopher Charles Taylor calls strong evaluation. I have some good, I'm not always articulate about it, that I organize my practical action around. All human beings, insofar as they have coherent identities and aren't having an identity crisis, have some kind of semblance of a pattern around their identity and what they think the highest good is. So that's one way into, that's one way very briefly into one of Jamie's central theses in his book, which is that we're liturgical animals, which is a weird thing to read. I mean, right, that we're liturgical animals, maybe not to everybody. It should sound very weird. It does sound like fighting words to all my atheist friends, right? Because liturgy, of course, in the narrow sense, means like a pattern of worship, of ritual and worship within a religious community. I'm Catholic, so we tend to think of liturgy in a very, very specific way. But what's interesting is that part of what I take Jamie to be saying that's really challenging with we're liturgical animals is that all of us, because our identity is only completed through the medium of culture, and we have some highest good that we organize our identity around, we in a sense all have liturgies in that sense of like rituals of worship, or ways of forming and becoming coherent selves through the patterns of everyday life. And so in that expanded sense, which is part of what I really like about the book, everyone's got a liturgy, or at least that's the fighting terms of the argument, which I actually accept and agree with. And if that were true, by the way, as a political theorist, all political theorists should be studying liturgy, because liturgy is a feature of the completion of our agency around some highest good. Likewise, sociologists should probably be interested in liturgy. Maybe economists in their notion of rational choice, or at least neoclassical economics, would be troubled by the notion that we're liturgical animals. Political scientists maybe should be studying liturgy if Jamie is right. So of course the central problem with this, or one of the central problems, rival liturgies. Whose liturgy, how do I pick liturgies? Which liturgy should I allow to inform me? And one of the things that I like so much about Jamie's treatment is, as a good Augustinian, he doesn't just say, well, it's a simple either or. When I encounter liturgies or find myself in the midst of enacting liturgies, as a Christian, I always have to ask myself, how do these square or participate within the liturgies I've learned from following Christ or from the church, which, by the way, is not a self-evident thing, which I want to get into, the church or following Christ. But I have to ask myself, and so I have to ask myself always the question that figures so heavily in Jamie's political theology of discernment, of judgment. Can I cooperate with this cultural liturgy that I'm in the midst of or not as a Christian, right? Wise as serpents, innocent as doves. And so we have this problem of, if you like, the stuff outside, and Jamie does a wonderful job showing we've been conscripted into really kind of toxic liturgies. Maybe there's still some positivity in there, but it's sometimes very hard to see. Liturgies of consumerism, he talks about. Liturgies of nationalism, liturgies of white supremacy. Without even realizing it, our desires have been conscripted sometimes into patterns of worship that form us into certain kinds of selves. However, there's also the problem, and this is a little different. So there's the problem for Christians of like the liturgies that I encounter. Out there isn't quite the right word, because one of the things Jamie shows so well is I'm always in the midst of other liturgies. But for lack of a better word, out there, not of Christ, not of the church. But then there's the problem of intra-church. There are rival liturgies, right? Like whose liturgy, and this was coming out in this talk a little bit before dinner, like which liturgy do I participate in? Some of the questions in the earlier session. Is it okay to worship in a megachurch? As a Catholic, there's nothing self-evident about liturgies. Pope Pius X society and a certain nostalgia, attachment for the Latin Mass versus Vatican II modernizers who, to the Pope Pius people, look to Protestant, which is what Catholics lazily call everything they don't like sometimes. I don't do this. I don't like this habit of mine, but sometimes Catholics do this. So in other words, like whose liturgy? Because liturgy, and this gets to the beginning of a set of questions I have. Jamie, of course, calls this the Godfather problem, which is you can participate in liturgies, but end up like the characters in the famous movie The Godfather, doing all these atrocious things. So you can go baptize your child and you go murder people, right? And so it looks like you went through the liturgical shaping, but the kind of self you are is cruel, monstrous, not really marked by Christ in any clear way. So first question has to do or thought around the problem of, I'm going to use a philosophical term, the reification of liturgy. In other words, reification is just a fancy word for turning something that's not an object into object-like properties. So if I treat liturgy, if I reify liturgy, I treat it as an object that exists out there, and it does something to me. And as a hermeneuticist, as someone whose philosophical commitments I sketched out right there at the beginning, liturgy always completes itself through the medium of our culture and self-interpretive activity. So liturgy doesn't exist or do things to me. You can get into like spooky ways of talking, where liturgy is like this brute object out there that does things to me. But liturgy is in fact plural, and there are rival liturgies because liturgy is only completed through my self-interpretive activity. And so there's a possibility of a kind of crude liturgical literalism, you could almost call it. Sort of like biblical literalism, but of a different kind, where you assume that there's just a plain sense meaning free of all tradition that everyone can just see there. And there's a danger, I think, in treating liturgy this way, as though liturgy just automatically makes me a kind of a person. There's nothing about liturgy itself. Anyone who goes to a Catholic church on Veterans Day, sometimes I'm a little scandalized that the American flag is carried up, not because I'm not someone who identifies with the American Republic, but because I'm not sure that that's great worship. But most of my co-religionists don't seem to have any problem with singing the America the Beautiful on the way out of Mass on Sunday. And so there's nothing about liturgy per se that's automatic. It doesn't have a mechanical effect, which throws us back on the problem of rival traditions. So in other words, liturgy needs to be located in rival traditions, and we need some account of which tradition, whose tradition. And even, I would say as a Catholic, because the Catholics obviously love the word tradition, but tradition, there are rival political, theological traditions in the Catholic Church. I already hinted to that. The Catholic Church is as much a disaster and a mess and a little nest of anger right now in America as all the other churches and all the other non-churches in the country. We're all swimming in the same waters right now, right? So I wouldn't want to turn liturgy into a traditionalist concept. And it's not that I think that Jamie's doing that, but I think that part of what we need to think through are what are the rival political theologies that inform liturgy because simply doing liturgy doesn't automatically make me a Christian self or identity. So that gets me to my final 2 points. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Okay, so final 2 points here that have to do with locating me in a rival tradition, potentially, a political theological tradition. James, again, maybe not. I'm unsure. That has a point for further discussion. So as I said, I'm a Catholic and I situate myself in the Church's magisterium in promulgating its social teachings, one of which is the preferential option for the poor. And one place where I have a question around Jamie's account of Augustinianism, I agree with the permixtum and the already not yet. And in fact, the permixtum goes through my very heart. I mean, that's part of what's so profound about Augustine is the city, the allegiance is still up for grabs in your own heart. It's not even that I'm part of the city of God and you're part of the city of man. It's in time, in the seculum, as Jamie so beautifully described to us, I'm on a journey where I might still belong to Babylon. In fact, every morning when I get up, I usually still belong to Babylon. Sometimes by noon, a little Jerusalem in there. It takes a while before the itchy for me. So, but that discernment, I worry about the discernment in the sense that I personally would not want to use the term Christian realism or allow myself to be because although I profoundly agree with Jamie that liberalism, and here I think is so important, should be an either or. And I really worry about my Christian friends who have gotten into a stance. I'm not friends with Rod Dreher, but Rod Dreher type Christians who essentially have this completely oppositional, illiberal stance, people like Patrick Deneen, who is a Catholic, where liberalism has now become like of the devil or bad, right? And so what I worry about is discernment about participation in politics, which I agree with Jamie 100%. We have to look carefully. But what I want to add here is the discernment needs to be located. At least in my tradition, it needs to be located, though I don't hear Deneen saying this, with the poor and the marginalized. And what looks realistic with Christ's poor and the marginalized. He said, I was naked and you didn't clothe me. I was in jail and you didn't visit me. I was hungry and you didn't feed me. Christ indicates, this isn't a traditionalist argument, we have to have a bigger argument on this. I'm not proof texting, but my point is to gesture at the Catholic tradition of the preferential option for the poor, to locate discernment there. And if you locate discernment there, what looks realistic to me as a professor at Pepperdine is not the same as what looks realistic to someone whose child has just been separated from them and put in a cage. And it's not the same as what looks realistic to someone whose parents were put in mass incarceration and they face constant eviction. And so I would want to be very careful because that there are rival political theologies informing the rival liturgies, and part of the liturgical practice that I think we should take on is one of locating ourselves with the poor. I love this concept in Jamie's book at the end about the pastor's ethnographer, and one of the things that I think has really pissed people off about Pope Francis in these like kind of intra-Catholic tumults that we're having is that Pope Francis has a great genius for what Jamie calls pastoral ethnography, I think, which is discerning in what ways people have gotten into patterns, consumerism around the environment. Laudato Si is a brilliant document, I think, of disordered Christian relationship to creation, taking a secular notion of creation as just nature, as just an immanent frame, a bundle of stuff, as opposed to just thick with God's love in some sense. And Pope Francis has a way of paternally correcting us in a way that we're really uncomfortable with, particularly as American Catholics. So I think that discernment, I'm not sure to what degree I disagree with Jamie, but I would never avow the terms realism. And this gets at the sort of last point, which is I like Jamie, think there's something still value in the liberal tradition, but he tends to do a genealogy backwards to the past iteration of liberalism that needs rescuing, whereas my view is more aspirational or future-oriented. What I like about liberalism is the stuff it's never accomplished, but it says it's going to accomplish, like equality and human rights and pluralism. Something I love about liberalism, though I would never self-describe as a liberal, by the way, liberals being used here in the broad sense of the tradition that holds that individuals have rights prior to entry into society through a contract. We're not talking about liberalism in the narrow culture war sense that Americans use it. Part of what I like about liberalism is it actually bothered to deal with the problem of pluralism. And I hear so many people around me scandalized by pluralism, and here I share it to you, and just trying to resolve it by basically either eliminating the plural, which is going to look is going to look very, very dark, or I don't know, shutting yourself up in a silo where everyone agrees with you. But what interests me about liberalism is its aspirations and not anything it's done in the past, which for me is all post-fall, and so therefore not Eden, and so not something to go back to, no direction home, like Dylan says. You just got to keep pressing on, it's most Augustinian. You have to keep pressing on, no direction home. And in this sense, the figure I want to bring up is of St. Thomas More. And here I again probably have a bit of a disagreement. I don't think of utopia as a bad word. A canonized saint in the church invented that term. And I don't have time to go into it entirely, but part Christ's parables, they don't give us blueprints. What they give us is an already that's happening that helps us imagine a not yet that we are actually compelled as Christians to try to enact or bring into being in some sense. And so I worry, and I'll leave it with this word, I worry that the narrative, the meta-narrative level, Jamie's saying that we need to go back to Christian sources to find what's good about liberalism, doesn't do enough justice to multiculturalism and deep diversity, and actually feeds into a narrative where what we need, I don't think he wants to do this, but what we need is emergency restoration of liberalism by Christians. In a way, I think a lot of the Christians who are involved in sort of an what I would describe as an authoritarian turn, ethno-nationalist turn, think they're basically rescuing liberalism to some degree, some liberal stuff, broadly construed as a society of rights, and et cetera, through the reassertion of kind of Christian values informing public policy and so on. So I think we need to look into deep, diverse sources, multicultural sources, that's another question I have, and not just go back and think, well, what's good about liberalism is what I found that Christians put there. I actually think part of an Augustinian participational eschatology is I have to discern and look in other places. The church gets bigger through its encounter with other traditions. It always gets bigger because it finds Christ already there waiting for you, because in fact, Christ also created the people who are not Christians. And so in fact, they have some good stuff there that we need to learn from. So I don't think any of this is oppositional so much to Jamie, just he's such a provocative thinker that here I am thinking out loud and trying to grapple with his contribution. So thank you.
I just want to ask a couple questions and then make sure that you all are engaged in the conversation here. Maybe just as a quick one, Jim, did you want to respond to some of the points, especially these last ones?
Yes, a lot. Very helpful, very helpful. I'll just respond for the sake of time to the last one, which is, yes, that's a good point. So it's interesting, I'm an Augustinian of the Calvinist stripe, which means I think what I like about that early, I'm less interested in repristinating early modern liberalism. I was more interested in going back to early modern, what O'Donovan calls Christian liberalism, because it was set up as a system for people who have suspicion about themselves. Do you know what I mean? Like it was set up as a system of checks and balances for people who don't trust themselves. And the more I think about it, the more I think I have a predilection for that because I'm a Calvinist. And interesting, I would say, and some of our founding fathers the same, right? So I do think there's a kind of mid-Atlantic, John Adams sort of sensibility that says what's most important is we need a system that protects us from our own hubris and calm. In that sense, that's why I sort of look back to it. But you're right. In a sense, I want that aspirational dynamic because you might remember there's a section in the book where I say, in some ways, the civil rights movement under Dr. King and others was kind of an embodiment of what I imagined as one of the best forms of political, actually I think I call it Christendom project. Because they were saying, no, this city should look more like that coming city. And there's no reason why we can't get closer. And so I take that, that's a very helpful word. I'll just say that. That's a very helpful emphasis on not turning back a clock to recover something. It really is about just making sure we have systems in place to check our hubris and yet not give up on aspiration.
So I want to begin just by actually also responding to you, Jason. Great comments. I think before we get into a discussion around rival liturgies, I don't think we're at a point where we're even thinking liturgically. And I think that's some of what Jamie is getting at too. And I think what was so revolutionary, frankly, for me in reading this book was to think liturgically about not only the democratic Catholic system, but the others. Right? I mean, I remember I had an economics professor who had grown up in communist Hungary, and she said there was a phrase growing up that people used to say, they pretend to pay us, so we pretend to work. And if you see that as, that shapes you, that forms you, right? And I think in many ways you were talking here about the liturgies that deformed, but also understanding our Christian liturgy, even understanding that there may be rival ones, can be a way to respond to that. So I wanted to just ask Jamie an important question here. You know, I want to quote this from your book around political theology. Quote, "A political theology is not just the application of ideals. It is the learning how to inhabit this history of divine action that is tethered to particular times and actions." That's pretty exciting. And so one of the things I think you do so effectively in the book, but I want to explore it here, is you speak to Christians that have disordered politics in treating it, in eminentizing the eschaton, right? In whether on the left and right, but placing it in a place where politics is everything. But you also speak to those that have dismissed politics, that it's just kind of a dirty business, and as you say, that it's more of the earthly city. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more to both of those audiences that have essentially disordered the place of politics in their lives.
Yeah, and I think my big burden there is, can you all hear me okay? Yeah. The big burden there is neither of those options, those extremes, politics is everything or to hell with politics, neither of those streams does much to care for the vulnerable. And they also don't give us room for prudential judgments that we can then discern collectively about a way forward. So I think one of the things that's most disappointing about the current moment in which we find ourselves is not even Christians have a sufficient frame, account, space, capacity to disagree on these things without immediately demonizing our opponents, or anathematizing our those who disagree with us, or just sticking our fingers in our ears and we pretend that the church is some sort of apolitical space and please don't talk about it. I don't know if you found that in DC. What struck me is I lived in DC last spring for the semester. You show up at church and there's an illusion about that. And so I think what I try to do in the book too is I say the good of politics is really rooted in creation itself, right? That we need to forge a life in common beyond families. That's built into the very structure of creation itself. So in a way, we are carrying out humanity's cultural mandate by answering a political call. Then the question is, well, what does it look like to do that now? After the fall, after Christ's incursion in history, but before kingdom come. I don't know, I feel like I haven't answered your question very well.
No, you have, but I just want to layer another thing and draw you and Jason as well, because I think one of the other challenges and one of the reasons why we are so polarized on our views of politics, particularly Christians, is that we've lost sight of where politics is actually impacting us, which is at the local level. So this understanding around subsidiarity, and that everything has been, I call the C-SPANification of our politics, right? That everything is a focus on what's happening in DC, as opposed to, I doubt anybody in this room knows who the mayor of Malibu is. Or the fact that if you care about foster kids, that's a county issue. And I don't know how many people know who our county supervisors are here in LA. So this understanding of the importance of governance at the local level around a set of issues, whether it's school boards or the poor or foster kids, that I wonder if that might be part of the issue too, is a wrong ordering of our political loves federally. Thoughts on that?
I'll just try, I want to hear from you on this. I think one of the effects of secularization on our political climate is that if we have functionally and practically, by the way, even a lot of Christians are functionally secularized. If we have functionally decided that there is no eternity and no heaven that really matters, then all of a sudden all we're left with is our now and us. And it looks like politics is the strategy by which we will solve problems. Then politics has to be absolutely everything. Like it is the last, which is why now we treat political difference like heresy and orthodoxy kind of thing. So I think secularization explains partly why we overexpect from politics. Would you guys, I don't know, I do feel like there is, to call it the C-SPANification, I've never heard it that way. I think it's very
That's me.
That's good. You can get the
T-shirts for sale.
I don't want to throw an industry under the bus, but there must be some way in which media functions in such a way to turn federal politics into a spectator sport.
Yes.
And not something that we are all
That's very
engaged with,
That's very good.
as you say, at various levels. And in all kinds of, I also think there's a kind of political life that is non-governmental too.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a Tocquevillian, so I agree with this in a sense, but subsidiarity, which is of course a term that comes out of Catholic social teaching tradition, I usually hear used by people who kind of incline conservative to push a bunch of stuff down the ladder, unaware that subsidiarity also means that you can push a bunch of stuff up the ladder, and that it's a prudential judgment about what's required to secure that good. And so there are certain goods like ecological crisis, in the given situation we have, which I don't consider ideal, but highly atomized things that Tocqueville worried about,
Right.
where some things actually do have to be passed up the ladder, I think, I would argue prudentially. Although I agree 100% that localism is a place where we lose our political bearings in a very positive way. I
Right.
stop seeing abstractions, I start seeing human people,
Yep.
I start cooperating with my neighbors. My students can tell you that I'm a Tocquevillian, but I would put the stress more on the fact that subsidiarity isn't just used to push goods down the ladder, but in fact, it implies in our own day and age a globalism, even a global governance that I almost never hear my Christian friends on the right talk about, which is, the ecological crisis is going to require either shutting down into like life raft ethno-nations, what I like to call eco-fascism, or cooperation to like fix the mess a little bit. And so to me, subsidiarity also means things like possibly world coordination around certain, I'm not saying world government, but world coordination around certain goods that can only be secured at that level.
I want to open up to some questions from the audience. I'm sure we have a bunch. We have a microphone coming around to make sure where you want to get this gentleman in the back.
Sure, thank you.
Okay. Jason Blakely mentions Drea, and indeed the last time that I was at an event sponsored by the School of Public Policy was when Drea gave the campus and gave a talk about his book, the Benedict Action, and and I have to say I was struck by how different I think his vision of politics and the presentation that Jimmy Smith gave tonight. I have a question for Jimmy Smith. You talked about compromise, or you mentioned compromise, right, in your talk. And I think it's such a tough thing. Thinking of politics, right? The number of moderates, people who identify themselves as political moderates, have been shrinking in the last 20 years, right? And those are the people who are most inclined to compromise. But can you say a little bit more about your notion of compromise, both within politics and maybe in other arenas as well?
Yeah. So it's very important. I'm trying to give it an important adjective, which is faithful compromise, which I think will always be an exercise in discernment and that there will be room for Christians to have prudential differences in judgments about those matters. But one way to put it is anybody who votes for a presidential candidate this November is compromising on not just something, a myriad of things. Now that's not the greatest example, because ultimately what I would love to do is think about like where we're actually trying to forge legislation and policy and why there's a give and take. And I think the Christian should have a tempered expectation of what can be accomplished here and now given a history, and you go for what you hope. What I think is important, or what at least I think would be a good exercise, is if we were just all honest and say there's no pure Christian political act in the secular. There's no, if Augustine means anything, none of us are pure. Nobody gets to cover the mantle of congratulating themselves that they voted Christian. You don't, just because you picked this candidate does not mean that you have purity. Instead, what I think we should do is be honest that we are all compromising, and we have the burden to be able to articulate our compromise theologically and with a rigor about it. So
Right.
if I tell you, well, I'm not. If some of you will be deeply disappointed who I would vote for in November. All I want is for us to be able, as Christians, to have a conversation in which I offer a defense for the judgments I made about compromise, such that I think that was still the faithful, prudential decision in the meantime. I think purity and ideological purity is a myth, but I also think it's what drives our polarization. And it's exactly why we're not getting anything done in that regard. So it's faithful compromise in that it's not just like, oh, well, you've got a blank check, the world is done. Do you remember the film The Mission?
Yeah.
The Mission? Remember at the end where the cardinal said, no, not the cardinal, the governor says to the cardinal, who's made a terrible, difficult decision, we live in the world is thus. It's not your fault. And the cardinal says, no, Senor Hunter, thus have we made the world, thus have I made it. I think owning that responsibility, by the way, in confession, I think confession is a really important political practice, goes a long way to thinking about that. Sorry.
That's good. Did you have anything you wanted? Let's come over here, if you can.
Thank you very much. This is a real treat for us here at Pepperdine. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
Jason, thank you, and excellent job. And Pete, I appreciate this. You putting this together. This is great for us. So I have a question for you regarding, is our presidential election a liturgy?
Oh.
And one of our great thinkers, I'm from the Church of Christ tradition, one of our great thinkers, a fellow by the name of David Lipscomb, probably our most important thinker in the 20th century, certainly in defining our movement.
Yeah.
He opted out of that liturgy. He says, I will not participate. He didn't call it a liturgy, but he said, I will not participate in that process. That's one of the wings of our movement.
Yeah.
I would love to hear you, both of you, interact with that position that David Lipscomb took.
So that's, and would he have seen that as a bit of a kind of Anabaptist option?
I don't know if he would have phrased it in terms of Anabaptism.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So, I can't remember if I said this in the earlier session. I literally just became a U.S. citizen, like about a year ago. Precisely because as an Augustinian Christian, I actually don't think I have the luxury of not being implicated. So I wanted to own my implication and then act with agency as insofar as I can within that. Now, so I'm skeptical of the privilege that actually is exercised when one thinks they can step back. And what motivates it. Now, however, to the earlier half of your question, is the presidential election a liturgy? So technically, I would say not, because here's what characterizes a liturgy. A liturgy is a social rhythm, pattern, communal action that is repeated frequently. And we do this every 4 years, right? It's an act every 4 years. Now, if you ask me, are presidential campaigns liturgies? And I'm not trying to split hairs, but I do think that there's a difference. And the collective function of campaigns does shape our political imagination and our way of interacting. Now, again, I just don't think as a matter of being called to be a citizen who's nonetheless faithful and caring for my neighbor, because I think presidential elections, federal elections, local elections, all make a difference for the lives that my neighbors inhabit. I think I need to be participating. But doing so hopefully without any illusion, and maybe hopefully also participating in such a way that I'm doing it with those glasses on, so I realize, oh, I see what's going on here. Do you know what I mean? Like, in some ways, when my son used to ask, will you take me to the temple, and he meant, will you take me to the mall? That's because we had this conversation where I was like, you know the mall is a temple, right? You know it's trying to like teach you to love stuff. And so at least, but the fact that he remembered it means he's like, oh, okay, this isn't just a neutral space. I think if we recognize it's not a neutral space, that's the beginning of our not being as suckered by it, maybe with the relative claim.
So in the immortal words of that great Canadian Geddy Lee, the band Rush, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice.
Yeah, see, that's very good.
Wasn't sure I was gonna pull Rush in here. Did you have something on that, Chris?
I agree.
Okay.
Amen.
Okay. Okay, one more question, and my man Stuart Davenport. Thank you.
Hey,
Make it good, bro.
I liked very much what you had to say about compromising on the way to the voting booth. And I was thinking, it related to liturgy, related to culture, related to identity, is the ills that we're experiencing right now, is that in some way a reflection or a function of the fact that our identities are in flux. So someone on the way to the voting booth, I'm a social justice warrior. This is my issue. I care about the environment. This is my issue. I care about the Supreme Court and abortion. This is my issue. I care about whatever. And so it's not just here are the compromises that I'm making, but here's who I am. And with all of these identities and issues in massive flux right now. I'm a history professor. I'm kind of curious about what the bottom turtle is. I don't think I know it yet, although I'm not a Marxist, but I think it's economic. Maybe we can talk about that sometime. But LGBT issues as well. So identity. Okay, boomer versus millennial. Identity. But to take all of this fragmentation and to try to consolidate it into at least two camps, which is politics comes down to two usually. And unfortunately, it has to do with generation and race. And so my question is, first to the kind of general point, do you think that identity is impacting all of these things individually, because we're broken up into all of these much smaller tribes, but then kind of the two clumps? Because I'm a professor of American history, there's a certain tribe that is fearful of dying. And that tribe is white, and that tribe is getting older. And there's a new tribe that is diverse and LGBT and open to kind of whatever, that is ascendant. Is this the tribalism and the cultures and the liturgies and however you want to describe it that we're unfortunately falling into? And sorry, one last thing. What should I invest in tomorrow? I'm speaking very generally and very secularly. In what way would you say that Christianity would inform those two tribes?
I feel like you and Jason could probably answer the genealogical question of what got us here better than I could. I mean, I do think it relates to, I think identity politics is a symptom, not a cause. And I think it's partly a symptom of this secularization dynamic and the how much we stake. Identity is sort of the story we grab onto to make sense of ourselves, and then that's easily politicized. I just think we also need to realize that these things are so manipulable by political machines that in some ways I don't want to blame. I don't want to necessarily blame the citizens who are acting that way, because I think they've actually also been primed to do so by political machinations that are much bigger, and that I also think are very cynical. And I mean cynical in a very, very technical sense, like they in a way don't care, except winning. And in that sense, I think we are more susceptible to that. Insofar as people had, there's a bit of a Robert Putnam story to be told here about, insofar as when people had sort of meaningful communal relationships where they found security, to be honest, but also being known, it meant that they related to the dynamics of political machines differently, right? They expected less from them. I'm not, again, I feel like this is your terrain.
It's a tough question. I mean, it's a huge question. I guess just one thing to say about it is I don't think of identity politics as something separate and hived out, and I don't think of it as bad. I essentially think of it as inescapable because of the hermeneutic reasons I laid out. I mean, being Republican is an identity, being Democrat is an identity, being liberal is an identity, being conservative is an identity, being gay is an identity, being Christian is an identity. And what's different is that the metaphysical and sociological underpinnings for my identity aren't guaranteed for me beforehand. And people have a kind of Edenic nostalgia for some society where recognition was already guaranteed or automatic. And instead, we all live out this fragility, as Charles Taylor says in Secularity, a book that Jamie has written a very, very good primer on, which I highly recommend. But if you want a window down version, because his version is like 1,000 pages. So I don't think there's an option B to identity politics for modern people, because we lived in shared plural spaces where we step out on stage and then look for recognition. And so I think all politics is identity politics, not something to bash around in that sense.
Please join me in thanking Jamie. I just wanted to close with this one quote from Jamie's book, and it goes back to this discussion around Boniface, which I thought, as the dean of a policy school, was quite encouraging. So this is Jamie talking about Augustine's letters to Boniface, which he just referenced earlier. And he notes, and I quote, "In these letters we hear something of Augustine's hopes for Boniface and those like him, the hope for faithful agents of the coming kingdom, who answer the call to public life, who administer the common good in this seculum of our waiting. Such public servants bear heavy burdens on our behalf and find themselves pressed on every side. Many, like Boniface, are honestly hungry for theological counsel and scriptural wisdom for a messy world. The pastor theologian not only needs the theological chops to answer their questions with a robust theology of public life, above all, the pastor theologian needs love." And so I hope what you got from tonight, at least in part, is how important these questions are. These are obviously questions that we wrestle with at the School of Public Policy, where our students wrestle with. But it's important that we have pastor theologians, and I would put you in one of the categories, and tonight, Jason, you as well. And I would put you in that category. Because those of us who believe that we're called to lives of public service are entering into messy worlds, but ones that we believe that we are called into. But nonetheless, we do need to be informed by great books like this. So thank you all for coming out. And God bless you.